Now it is. All right. So, hello. We have with us Melad Yusuf Ibrahim. Studied in diplomacy and law, and he's been a lecturer in Afghanistan. He's a political analyst and public relations consultant. And so, we're going to get a few points of views from you regarding Afghanistan and the human rights issues within it, and other cases as well regarding corruptions and other. I'll start with Mohammed. Would you like to ask the first question?
Thank you, Robbie, again for another wonderful program. We have the honor to have our guests tonight, Melad Yusuf Ibrahim, an expert on Afghani issues and politics, who has advised human rights groups and also who has been involved in the Afghani politics. Welcome, Yusuf Melad, to our Everyday Politics show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. And it is an honor to see you guys again.
Thank you. My first question is the Afghanistan, we know, has been through a lot of things. It has been the place where the Soviet and the NATO conflicts were rife. We knew what happened after that. After the demise of the Soviet Union, there was the civil war in Afghanistan, groups fighting against each other. Then the most important one I'm coming to is from the point where after September 11, United States of America had the responsibility to do something about Taliban, which they blamed was behind that huge and big explosions that rocked New York. And from there, we know that some critics of the American, both from the West and from the East and from the Muslim world, argue that that was an invasion or occupation. But the United Nations has unanimously agreed on the war the American waged on Iraq, because also the government in Iraq has invited and asked for help from the international community to fight Afghanistan, because it wasn't strong enough to challenge the Taliban. Could you talk to us about what happened after that? Are there any tangible progress that can be achieved in terms of state building, peace building? Are there any setbacks that maybe things could have been done in a different way, a better way?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that it was the Islamic State of Afghanistan and not Iraq. That's the first thing I want to make clear. And
Okay.
About the critics of some people in the West, especially the leftist parties, and in the Islamic countries, especially those people who are opposing the American foreign policy, arguing the assumption that Afghanistan has been invaded by the Americans, while it was not the case. First of all, because by the internet, it does not meet the international legal requirements of an invasion or an occupation, because the NATO forces and the American forces have entered Afghanistan with the permission of the former president of Afghanistan and the Grand Lawyer General of Afghanistan, which was held in the city of Bonn in Germany. So by international requirements, it does not meet by international standards, it does not meet the requirements of an invasion. Even by domestic descriptions, it does not meet the requirements of an invasion, because the Afghans, who are the legitimate, internationally recognized government, they have invited the international forces to come and help the Afghan people against the terrorism of Taliban and Al Qaeda. The second thing I want to make clear is that the Taliban was not responsible for 9/11. It was the group Al Qaeda who was responsible for 9/11. The problems that the Americans had is that Taliban were giving shelter to Al Qaeda members and Osama bin Laden, which has also not been true at the end, because at the end we all know that Osama bin Laden has been found in Pakistan and he has been killed there, and rightly so, in Pakistan. So therefore, we might, on the other side, we might be able to have some doubts about the support of Taliban to Al Qaeda, while in reality, we witness that the Pakistan government has been sheltering a terrorist group inside their territory.
What do you think of a sovereign state putting its right down to be sovereign and allowing other armies to come and intervene in their laws and their peace building and their current processes and procedures as a state? So, where's the line where state sovereignty keeps the state sovereign, and where's the line where the state is no longer sovereign?
Well, where the line is about having the free will and the power to give permission for other forces to enter your territory, your country, in accordance with the laws of your country. So when the former Afghan President Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was also an Islamic scholar, he allowed the international forces in the name of and then the name of Afghanistan, the official name of Afghanistan was the Islamic State of Afghanistan. On behalf of his government, he allowed the American forces to come and help the internationally legitimately recognized government of Afghanistan to help and combat terrorism. That is a sign, and that is the practice of national sovereignty when a president allows foreign forces into the country to combat rebellious groups. So I think the Afghans have practiced their right of sovereignty in this case, and to call it an invasion, it would be a very grave mistake and an insult to the Afghan people who know that their country has never, ever in the history of its existence been governed by a colonial power or a foreign power. The British tried, it didn't work. The Russians tried, it didn't work. The ancient Greeks tried to govern us based on colonial structures. It didn't work, and it hasn't worked ever. So the Afghan people will never ever allow their country to be governed by colonial structures.
Sorry,
And
just
in the case of invasion or an occupation.
just for
Right.
a fun fact, when you say Greece, do you mean Alexander the Great?
Yeah, so we have the Afghans have a strong history of resistance against foreign invaders and foreign occupations, such as the Greeks, the British, the Indians, the Russians. At that time, it was the Soviets. So it has not been, we have never experienced any kind of colonial rule or colonial structure in the country. And the coming of the Americans, we would see it more as a alliance of countries who are fighting and combating terrorism and extremism in the region.
Right. Okay. Now, moving away from this point, let's now move on to what progress has been achieved.
Uh-huh.
So still we can see
Well,
Afghanistan is still transitioning. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's not yet stable. Taliban is still active. But talk to us about what tangible progress has been gained in terms of state building, in terms of the institutions of the government becoming viable. We're talking about the three arms of the government, the legislature.
after especially after the disappearance of Taliban from the actual rule, because there was a in the time of the civil war between the United Front and some Western media and Eastern media, they called them the Northern Alliance, but the Northern Alliance has never existed. It was the Afghanistan's People's United Front of combating terrorism and extremism. At that time, when Afghanistan was in the middle of war, we officially did have a system of trias politica, which had a very fine and good description of separation of powers, the executive power, the legislative power, and the judiciary power. We had a proper definition of it. But after the disappearance of Taliban, we have put that into practice, and a new parliament has came into existence, and the judiciary was reformed, and the executive power began to exercise its powers based on this theory of separation of power. However, we try to go towards a more democratic country, and a country that was based on the values of the Islamic scriptures and Islamic law, but mixed with international recognized principles of human rights and good governance. However, there are a lot of things that there were a lot of things that went wrong, and we have to recognize that with the foreign aid coming from the European countries and the United, well, I can't call it foreign aid, we can call it compensation, or we can call it contribution from the Western countries in order for the Afghans to combat terrorism. You cannot call it aid, because the Afghans have never received the money for free. We did something for it. We had the same enemy, and with the money the Americans and the Europeans sent to the Afghans, they have fought extremism, and so it's more something of a alliance contribution instead of foreign aid. So with that, with this, but for this purpose, we can call it foreign aid. But the foreign aid, a lot of things went wrong because the Americans and the Western non-governmental organizations were full. But I'm not saying that the Afghan government was not fraudulent, or the Afghans did not commit any fraud or corruption with the aid, which was supposed to aid the Afghan government in order to progress more in regard to the human rights, good governance, fighting narcotics, and fighting heroin traders and drug criminals and drug bosses. Those aids were a bit, there went something wrong in the process of delivering the aid to the Afghan people. Instead, the aid went into the pockets of the big American firms, such as the Blackwater, such as other non-governmental organizations which were closely allied and related to the American government and the European Union, and some officials who had links with other Western countries. So in that area, no one can disagree that things did not went wrong. The Afghans had their own part in this big system and a spider web of corruption, while at the same time we cannot deny the role of non-governmental organizations and corrupt companies which were supported by the international community. We cannot deny their role as well.
All right. Okay. We know that, yes, you've mentioned the corruption, you've mentioned the resources going back to American or Western governments or some non-governmental organizations. Is that what you?
No, I have not said the resources going back to those to the governmental organizations. I have said that corruption and fraud have been committed with the resources which was supposed to and which were designed for the people of Afghanistan. Corruption has been committed, fraud has been committed in that area, and that is the major reason why the Afghan government has not been fully operating the way we all hoped it to be.
So where was this corruption coming from? Was it a collaboration between the Afghani elite, I mean the ruling, and the academics, or whoever is, can fit into that?
The corruption is, we cannot deny the role of the Afghans in the corruption process as well. We cannot deny that. It is a fact, but it was also co-founded and co-hosted by some companies and non-governmental organizations who came from the West and did not have a proper monitoring system in order to monitor the aid to Afghanistan. So we can say that both parties had some role in the corruption and fraud.
All right, coming back to the previous question about the institutions and what progress has been made. Let's take
Mhm.
an example, the judiciary. There are critics who are claiming that people are more confident with the Taliban court of system than the government in the
Mhm.
rural areas where, for example,
Yeah.
is it because of fear from the Taliban, or is it because there is corruption and injustice from the government, and they are turning to the Taliban as an alternative way of resolving conflicts or resolving cases?
Well, that is actually a very good question because when I was a human rights consultant to a few human rights groups and a private consultant to a human rights commissioner, the cases like these came up a lot. There are two reasons for that. One of them is because the in some areas, not the majority of areas, but there are some areas where Taliban are the boss and they have a government, a de facto government, so so that it might be very convenient for the people to go to the Taliban court in order to solve their problems, rather than the Afghan court, than the official governmental court. And the second reason can also be that within the judiciary system of the new Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, there are a lot of cases of fraud, injustice, and long processes. So people are kind of afraid of that, so they would rather to solve it by traditional means. And there is another factor as well, that people go to the tribal elders in order to solve their problems in the way of the traditional way. So it has something to do with a mix of fraud, corruption, injustice within the Afghan judiciary, also convenience, and also short process of solving the problem.
I just have a couple of questions, if that's okay, Mohammed. You talked about aid is not really aid, although when it comes to European aid or American aid, when it comes to Afghanistan, of course
Yeah.
they have to gain something. For example, the EU asked for human rights application in return for aid. This is for the improvement, so they can see that the aid is going to help Afghanistan someday. Or do you think
Well.
that the only purpose of the aid is to kind of keep
Mhm.
Afghanistan under control?
Well, it is the Europeans and the Americans. When I'm talking here, while I'm talking here, I want to clarify that I want to out my opinion based as an independent political analyst and a former advisor, not as as a Dutch Afghan citizen. So let me be clear about that. But if you have listened to the interview with the current president of Afghanistan and the current vice president of Afghanistan last week, they have said that we have had an alliance and cooperation with Western governments, and that their aid and they in some way, and there are also other politicians who say that this is not aid, this is just a contribution to combat terrorism, because there are other countries in the world as well, for example Kenya, Somalia, where they can use some millions of dollars
Yeah.
in order to improve the living standards of their citizens. But the Americans and the Europeans don't just go there and give them trillions of dollars, because that's not interesting for them, and that region is at this moment not very important for their interests. So the Europeans and the Americans can call it whatever they want to, but the way the Afghan politicians see it, it's a contribution to combat terrorism and fighting extremism.
Yeah.
So it's not aid, it's a contribution to combat terrorism, because the Afghan soldiers are, the war in Afghanistan is not just a war between two groups, or for example, the government and the Taliban. If it was just a matter of internal problems and internal disagreements, the Afghans could solve it within a matter of a year. It's not a big, it would not be a big issue, because the Afghans believe in the way of the problem solving, especially when it comes to politics, via the traditional means of jirga, which is the assembly of tribal elders. They can solve their problems. However, the war in Afghanistan is a proxy war between superpowers such as China, Russia, Iran, regional superpowers such as Iran, Pakistan, India. So many different channels and many different countries are playing their role in the continuous war in Afghanistan. So it's not an Afghan problem. This is an international problem, and international problems require international contributions to solve the problem, and that you cannot call aid.
Moving into another topic, which you've just did in your conclusion for the previous one, which is the geopolitics, the geopolitical interests and the regional interests of states in Afghanistan. Could you talk? I'm more interested to find out about the regional states and what interest they have got in Afghanistan, and who they rather back. Is it, do they want a Taliban dominant power, or do they want non-Taliban, or the government, the official recognized government?
Different countries have.
For example, let me finish. For example, what are India's interests in Afghanistan, because they have got a strategy? What are Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan? Iranian interest in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. The region, first of all.
Well, there are regional. In a lot of countries where Americans are active as a political or military ally of then countries such as Russia and China mainly disagree with them and disagree with their presence in that country. But this time in Afghanistan, the Russians are very happy with the presence of the Americans in Afghanistan, and the Chinese as well, because the Americans are an ally of the Afghan people and the Afghan government in order to combat terrorism. So it might be a good, it might benefit the Russians and the Chinese as well. However, we also have a country called Pakistan, which is a terrorist state and has always been supporting terrorists for the last 40 years in order to disrupt the internal Afghan processes and the Afghan and the Afghan society. We have noticed that with the presence of Osama bin Laden, the biggest terrorist leader of his time. Pakistan has a totally different interest in Afghanistan. It has an interest of continuing the war, killing the Afghans, and having a very unstable and illegitimate government there, so they can do whatever they want to with Afghanistan. However, on the other side, we have the Islamic Republic of Iran, who is not a very big fan of the war in Afghanistan. However, they are looking very anxiously towards the presence of the Americans in Afghanistan, and they have been claiming that the Americans use the Afghan soil in order to make Iran an unsafe place, and in order to plan operations against this. Iran also has a interest in the peace in Afghanistan and with the withdrawal of the American troops from Afghanistan. So mainly the regional powers are, they quite agree with it, but except Pakistan, I agree with the peace in Afghanistan, except Pakistan. However, till a few years ago, the Saudi Arabians, they had a similar interpretation of Islam, like Taliban and some Arab countries. But as we can witness with the latest developments in the Arab wars, that the Saudi royal family and other Gulf countries located in the Gulf region are turning away from the extreme form of and the extreme description and the extreme form of Islam and religion towards a more moderate and normal Islam, the Islam which has always been the Islam, the peaceful Islam, the Islam of pro-education, pro-everything, pro-civil liberties, pro-freedom, the way the Afghans and the majority and the mainstream Muslim community in the world have always known Islam to be like. So that is actually a good news, because now the Taliban has less support, and due to the rise of ISIS, Daesh, there's support for extreme groups in the Arab countries has also been decreased.
All right, good point. Now, from another question from that point, Taliban is in Afghanistan, yes, but they cannot sustain without having maybe friendship or support from countries in the region or even bigger powers,
Exactly. Yeah.
because it's a proxy war. Are there any? I mean, what about Russian involvement? Are they
No,
kind of like,
the Russians have always been afraid of the extreme form of the extremism and fundamentalism in the region. So obviously they have had a few contacts, informal contacts and indirect contacts with the leadership of the Taliban in the past few years, but not in the form of taking them serious, but in the form of talk about a few matters and a few issues, and in order to have their role in the peace negotiation process, but not as they would not treat Taliban as their friends. However, the Pakistani state, which has been declared a terrorist state, has always been a friend of the Taliban and the extremism and and terrorism. And we could notice it with the presence of Osama bin Laden, the biggest terrorist of his time, in the Pakistani soil. So obviously, back to your question, the Taliban cannot exist without foreign aid and assistance of other state actors, and that state actor would be the terrorist state of Pakistan.
is it only Pakistan alone, or there are other states who you think have
So far,
even had?
so far in the studies which has been conducted by different international think tanks, political analysts, PhDs on who have been specialized in the Afghan politics, no other country have been mentioned as the main sustainer and provider of the Taliban except for Pakistan.
You're right.
Okay, just to conclude, this is part one of the interview.
Mhm.
There will be part two in the link in the description, or it will come up in a day or two. Thank you very much for watching, and
Thank you for having me.
we will catch you later on. Bye bye.